Flamethrowers are some of the most feared weapons ever used in war. They didn't just destroy bunkers and caves, they turned entire battlefields into firestorms and left behind scars that no soldier ever forgot. In this video, we're uncovering the entire dark truth about flamethrowers in World War II. From their origins in ancient warfare to their terrifying role in places like Iwo Jima, we'll explore why they were so effective, why they were so hated, and why even the men who carried them often didn't survive. And by the end, you'll understand why the world eventually decided these weapons had no place in modern combat. Long before World War II, humanity had already discovered the terrifying potential of fire as a weapon. In fact, some of the earliest recorded uses of fire in combat go back to the ancient world. The Byzantines perfected something called Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary liquid launched from siphons on ships during naval battles. Ancient sources describe it as a substance that stuck to surfaces, clung to ships, and could not be extinguished with water. To enemies, it seemed like supernatural fire, a divine punishment hurled from the heavens. Its secret formula was so closely guarded that it was eventually lost to history, but its impact was unforgettable. The fear of fire was now part of the battlefield. Fast forward to the Industrial Age, and fire once again emerged as a weapon of war. In World War I, technology gave fire new life. Trench warfare had bogged down the front lines in endless stalemates. Traditional weapons couldn't flush enemy soldiers out of deep dugouts or fortified trench systems. The Germans turned to innovation, and in 1915, they debuted the Flamethrower, or flamethrower. The first attacks were devastating. At Hooge in Belgium, German troops unleashed liquid fire that poured across the trenches. Flames filled the narrow earthworks, burning soldiers alive and forcing survivors to flee in blind panic. French officers who witnessed these attacks described them as nightmares made real and hell itself on earth. The effect wasn't just physical destruction, it was psychological terror. Even rumors of a flamethrower attack were enough to spread fear across entire sectors of the front. Though the flamethrower was still primitive, heavy, short-ranged, and often as dangerous to its user as the enemy, it had proven its worth as a weapon of shock and horror. By the end of World War I, all major armies had experimented with some form of flamethrower. They learned two crucial lessons. First, that fire could succeed where bullets and shells failed, and second, that flamethrower operators would always be marked men, carrying not just fuel, but the enemy's hatred on their backs. These lessons, learned in the mud of Flanders and Verdun, set the stage for what would come 2 decades later. When World War II erupted, the flamethrower would return, more advanced, more portable, and infinitely more terrifying. Between the wars, militaries didn't forget what they had seen in the trenches. Engineers and planners studied how to make flamethrowers lighter, deadlier, and more reliable. By the time World War II began in 1939, 2 distinct types of flamethrowers were ready to be unleashed: man-portable flamethrowers carried by infantry, and vehicle-mounted flamethrowers bolted onto tanks and armored vehicles. The man-portable designs usually consisted of a backpack with fuel tanks connected to a hose and nozzle. A small igniter at the tip allowed the operator to send out a stream of flaming liquid up to 30 to 40 yards. These models were terrifyingly effective at close range, but they had drawbacks. The operator carried over 60 to 70 pounds of volatile fuel on his back, making him a slow, obvious target. Snipers learned to pick out flamethrower troops instantly. Many flame operators didn't survive their first battle, either shot before they could fire or blown apart when their tanks exploded. Vehicle-mounted flamethrowers were another story. Tanks like the British Churchill Crocodile towed armored trailers full of fuel and could blast fire over 100 yards, turning bunkers into ovens. The Americans later fielded the Sherman Zippo, while the Japanese and Soviets also experimented with flame tanks. Mounted flamethrowers gave crews protection and terrifying reach, but they were still vulnerable. A hit on the fuel trailer of a crocodile, for example, could ignite a catastrophic fireball. One innovation changed everything: napalm. Developed in 1942 by Harvard scientists, napalm was a thickened gasoline that clung to surfaces and burned longer than raw fuel. With napalm, flamethrowers became exponentially more lethal. Flames stuck to walls, trees, and even enemy soldiers, creating an inescapable inferno. Suddenly, what had been a weapon of short, terrifying bursts in World War I was now a sustained, roaring torrent of fire. By the early 1940s, all major powers had flamethrowers in their arsenals. The Germans refined their Flammenwerfer models. The Soviets produced the ROKS series, cleverly disguising the weapon's nozzle to look like a rifle barrel so operators wouldn't be instantly targeted. The Japanese built their Type 93 and Type 100 flamethrowers, and the Americans pushed the M1 and later M2 into service across the Pacific. World War II was a war of innovation, and few weapons demonstrated the dark creativity of the human mind more than the flamethrower. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological instrument designed to terrify, to flush enemies from hiding, and to send a message: there is nowhere to run from fire. If there was any theater of World War II where the flamethrower became synonymous with sheer brutality, it was the Eastern Front. In the apocalyptic struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, battles were fought street by street, house by house, bunker by bunker. Here, the flamethrower was not just a weapon. It was a tool of survival in urban and close-quarters combat. German pioneer assault engineers carried the Flammenwerfer 35 and later the lighter Flammenwerfer 41. These men were sent forward to clear Soviet bunkers, cellars, and trench systems during the massive offensives into the Soviet Union. In the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, flamethrower operators advanced through rubble-filled streets, spewing sheets of fire into doorways and basements. For defenders huddled in the dark, there was no worse fate. Soviet survivors later recounted the horror of hearing the hiss of pressurized fuel just before flames roared in, consuming everything. But the Soviets were not defenseless. They developed their own flamethrowers, like the ROKS-2 and ROKS-3, which had a unique and deadly trick. To protect their operators from instant execution, Soviet designers disguised the nozzle as the barrel of a standard Mosin-Nagant rifle and shaped the fuel tanks to look like backpacks. At a distance, these soldiers blended in with ordinary riflemen. Only when the weapon ignited did the deception become clear. It was a clever design choice born of necessity, because on both sides of the front, flamethrower operators were priority targets. If captured, they were often executed on the spot. Soldiers viewed them as executioners rather than combatants, wielding a weapon that left no chance of a clean death. The Soviets also took firepower to another level by mounting flamethrowers on tanks like the OT-34, a variant of the famous T-34, which carried a flame projector in place of its hull machine gun. These tanks rolled up to German positions and turned pillboxes into infernos in seconds. German reports describe entire defensive lines collapsing after a single flame tank attack, as soldiers abandoned their posts in panic. The Eastern Front was already a theater defined by cruelty, but flamethrowers elevated the psychological terror to unimaginable heights. For defenders, the fear of being burned alive often outweighed even artillery bombardments. For flamethrower operators, it was a short and brutal career. Either you unleashed fire on the enemy, or you were gunned down before you could even squeeze the trigger. In a war remembered for its extremes of human suffering, the flamethrower was both a symbol and a tool of that brutality. While the Eastern Front saw flamethrowers used amid urban rubble and endless trench lines, the Western Front revealed just how much fear these weapons could inspire in German defenders. When the Allies launched the Normandy invasion in June 1944, they faced the nightmare of the Atlantic Wall, a series of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and machine gun nests bristling with firepower. Ordinary rifles and grenades couldn't dig German troops out of such fortifications. Flamethrowers could. On D-Day, U.S. Army and Marine flamethrower teams waded ashore carrying 70-pound tanks of fuel. In the chaos of Omaha and Utah Beach, they inched forward under withering fire, blasting flame into bunker embrasures. One short burst could turn a fortified position silent, either killing the occupants or forcing them to surrender. The spectacle of flame, a liquid tongue of fire curling into a pillbox, broke the will of many German defenders more effectively than any artillery shell. But it was the British Churchill crocodile that became the ultimate terror weapon in Western Europe. This modified tank replaced its hull-mounted machine gun with a flamethrower nozzle and towed a massive fuel trailer capable of firing over 100 bursts of flame. Its range of more than 100 yards meant that crocodiles could incinerate targets from safety, turning bunkers and trenches into fiery graves. German troops dreaded them. Many accounts describe defenders surrendering at the mere sight of a crocodile rumbling into range. In their eyes, there was no worse fate than to be trapped in a bunker as flames poured inside. The hatred for these tanks ran so deep that captured crocodile crews were often executed immediately by German forces, much like captured snipers. This grim fact shows the moral stain flamethrowers carried on the battlefield. They were effective, yes, but also considered dishonorable by those forced to face them. From Normandy through the liberation of France and into Germany itself, flamethrowers helped Allied forces dismantle one strong point after another. Yet their use carried a psychological cost. Even among Allied troops, flamethrower operators were often isolated, both because they drew enemy fire and because their weapon forced them to deliver deaths that were gruesome to witness. Soldiers would later recall how entire positions went silent after one blast, the enemy either consumed or too terrified to move. The weapon worked, but at a terrible moral price. If Europe showed the effectiveness of flamethrowers against bunkers, the Pacific theater revealed their full, horrifying potential. The island-hopping campaign fought by U.S. Marines and Army troops was defined by brutal, close-quarters combat against Japanese defenders who refused to surrender. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the Japanese built vast underground fortresses of caves, pillboxes, and tunnels, determined to hold out to the last man. For the Americans, standard weapons often couldn't reach these positions. The answer was fire. Japanese forces fielded their own flamethrowers early in the war, such as the Type 93 and Type 100, but their use was limited compared to the Allies. American engineers, on the other hand, carried the M1 and M2 flamethrowers into battle with growing frequency. They also developed specialized flame tanks, nicknamed Zippos, based on Shermans that replaced their main gun with a flame projector. These machines became essential for clearing fortified strongholds. On islands like Peleliu and Saipan, flamethrower teams advanced yard by yard, burning out caves where defenders were dug in with machine guns. The flame wasn't just fire. It consumed oxygen in enclosed spaces, suffocating soldiers deep inside even if they avoided the flames themselves. Survivors later described being driven to madness by the heat, smoke, and terror. Japanese veterans admitted they feared flamethrowers more than any other weapon. Some chose suicide charges rather than face being burned alive. For American operators, however, the role was equally grim. Carrying a 70-pound fuel tank made them slow, obvious targets. Japanese snipers singled them out immediately. Many flamethrower men didn't survive their first day of combat. One Marine recalled, "If you were a flamethrower, you were the first man they went after." Yet, despite the danger, they pressed forward, because without them, caves and bunkers would have cost thousands more lives to take. The Pacific Campaign showed the world a unique kind of hell. Jungles and volcanic rock turned into blazing infernos. The flamethrower became more than just a weapon. It was a psychological hammer that broke the will of defenders and turned the battlefield into something more primal, more terrifying, and more personal than any artillery shell could. Nowhere did flamethrowers define battle more than on Iwo Jima in 1945. This 8-square-mile island was a fortress honeycombed with tunnels and defended by nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers determined to fight to the death. For the Marines who landed there, flamethrowers became the key to survival, and also a death sentence for those carrying them. Operators like Corporal Don Graves remembered stepping ashore with 72 pounds of volatile fuel on their backs into a storm of bullets and artillery. Graves later recalled, "I'm the only flamethrower in 2nd Battalion that came off Iwo. We had 335 Marines going in. 18 came off. That staggering statistic, a 95% casualty rate, illustrates just how dangerous the role was. Flamethrower men were marked targets, hunted relentlessly by Japanese defenders who knew what awaited them if they let one get close. Despite the danger, flamethrowers proved decisive. None more so than in the hands of Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who became a legend on Iwo Jima. In one day of brutal fighting, Williams made 5 separate runs with flamethrowers and demolition charges, crawling forward under machine gun fire to attack pillboxes that pinned his comrades down. He climbed on top of bunkers, shoved flame nozzles through vents, and incinerated defenders inside. By the end of the day, he had silenced multiple positions single-handedly, earning the Medal of Honor. But for every hero like Williams, dozens of flamethrower operators died before they could even fire. The black volcanic sands and jagged rocks of Iwo Jima became littered with burned bunkers and shattered flamethrower tanks. Marines advanced through areas nicknamed the Meat Grinder and Hell's Pocket, where each foot of ground was won by fire and blood. By the time Iwo Jima was secured after 36 days, nearly every Japanese defender was dead, many consumed in flames. Out of 27 Medals of Honor awarded during the battle, 12 were given to men who destroyed positions with flamethrowers or explosives, though only half survived to receive them. Iwo Jima became the ultimate symbol of the flamethrower's terrible effectiveness. A weapon that could win battles, but at the cost of the men who carried it. The flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a nightmare that crawled into the minds of everyone who saw it. To the soldiers on the receiving end, it embodied one of the most primal fears: being burned alive. Unlike bullets or shells, which killed quickly and often unseen, the flamethrower was brutally personal. You could see the fire coming. You could feel the heat before it even reached you. And when it struck, there was no escape. Japanese veterans later admitted they feared flamethrowers above all other weapons. The detonation of a grenade might end life instantly, but the whoosh of flame meant agony, suffocation, and certain death. Bunkers often went silent after a single blast, not because everyone inside was killed, but because panic had already broken their will to fight. Some Japanese soldiers, rather than endure the flames, chose suicide charges or grenades against their own bodies. Fire, more than bullets, forced the mind into despair. But the horror wasn't only felt by the enemy. Flamethrower operators themselves carried scars that no metal could erase. Imagine shouldering 70 pounds of fuel, knowing that every enemy sniper was searching for you first. Imagine pressing the trigger, hearing screams erupt from a bunker you've just engulfed. Many veterans later admitted that the memories of using flamethrowers haunted them more than anything else they experienced in battle. Some described nightmares where they still heard those screams decades later. Others avoided talking about their service at all, unable to reconcile their actions with their conscience. On the battlefield, flamethrower troops were often isolated even within their own units. Fellow soldiers respected them, but also kept their distance. Not just because the tanks on their backs could explode, but because of the grim, almost cursed role they played. In both Europe and the Pacific, captured flamethrower operators were sometimes executed immediately. German soldiers saw them as wielders of an inhuman weapon, unworthy of mercy. The Soviets disguised their flamethrowers to look like rifles precisely because they knew snipers would target them above all others. This was the psychological truth of the flamethrower. It was not just a tool of destruction, but a weapon of fear. It destroyed morale as much as it destroyed fortifications. It scarred those who used it, and it terrorized those who faced it. Long after the flames burned out, the memories continued to smolder. When World War II ended in 1945, the world confronted not just the wreckage of cities and armies, but also the moral wreckage of the weapons that had been used. Among them, flamethrowers stood out. Images of scorched bodies, burned bunkers, and charred landscapes shocked civilians who had been shielded from the realities of battle. The flamethrower was technically legal under the laws of war. The Geneva Conventions had not explicitly banned it. But in the eyes of many, it crossed a line into barbarity. The weapon remained in service after 1945. It was used in Korea and most infamously in Vietnam, where napalm turned entire villages into infernos. The sight of children running from firebombs sparked outrage worldwide, and flamethrowers themselves became symbols of cruelty. Protesters in the 1960s carried signs condemning the use of fire weapons as crimes against humanity. Public opinion was turning, and militaries began to take notice. By the late 1970s, flamethrowers were disappearing from arsenals. The U.S. Department of Defense officially retired its flamethrowers in 1978, citing their limited tactical usefulness and the horrific image they projected. Other nations quietly followed suit. In 1980, the world community came together to pass Protocol 3 of the UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which banned the use of incendiary weapons like flamethrowers against civilian populations and restricted their use even against military targets in populated areas. While not an outright prohibition, it was an acknowledgement that fire as a weapon inflicted suffering beyond the pale. Today, flamethrowers are largely relics of the past, preserved in museums or displayed at military reenactments. They survive more as symbols than as tools, reminders of an era when war blurred the line between necessity and cruelty. Yet the debate lingers. Were flamethrowers justified in battles like Iwo Jima, where they saved thousands of Allied lives by silencing fortifications quickly? Or did they represent the darkest side of human ingenuity? A descent into fear and suffering that no cause could ever justify? The world chose to phase them out, but the shadow they left remains. The flamethrower was not just another weapon of World War II. It was a moral dilemma made of fire, one that forced humanity to look at itself in the mirror of its own cruelty.